Comrades, hear me now. The world as you know it is not broken. It is functioning precisely as designed. The poverty that gnaws at your children's bellies, the exhaustion that crushes your backs, the injustice that fills your courts, these are not accidents, nor the failings of individuals. They are the inevitable product of a system that thrives upon your submission. The capitalist order under which we toil is not neutral, not benevolent, not blinded, is deliberate, systematic, and calculated to serve the few while draining the many. Do you see it? The machinery of profit grinds on, indifferent to your suffering. Each factory whistle, each late paycheck, each mortgage payment enslaves you further, while those who control capital sit insulated from the consequences of their greed. You are made to endure long hours, insecure work, and precarious lives, not because it is necessary, but because your endurance is the fuel of their power. The system only changes when the oppressed recognize that suffering is a choice they are complicit in perpetuating by silence, by compliance, and by isolation. Understand this: there is nothing natural about poverty, nothing inevitable about exploitation. Capitalism does not reward merit, it rewards ownership. It does not value labor, it values the surplus extracted from your labor. Each product you create, each service you render, is transformed into profit that flows to the hands of those who do not toil, who do not sweat, who do not risk. The illusion of freedom under this system is maintained only by distraction, by competition, by the belief that your misery is personal, that it is your fault, and that it is unchangeable. But history is not made by those who endure it, is made by those who rise. Every leap forward, every revolution, every transformation of society has been the work of the united, the conscious, and the determined. The bourgeoisie fears not the complaints of the individual, but the solidarity of the collective. Workers, the peasants, the oppressed, the disenfranchised, recognize their shared condition, understand the structures that bind them, and refuse to endure quietly. The chains of the few begin to crumble. You must see yourselves as the architects of your liberation. To endure is to consent. To accept suffering is to legitimize the system that imposes it, organize, educate, and unify. The factory floor, the office, the school, the street, these are battlegrounds where consciousness must awaken. Speak to your fellow workers. Reveal the hidden mechanisms of oppression, challenge the myths of meritocracy, and illuminate the ways the system thrives on your obedience. The power of the few rests on the passivity of the many. Disrupt that passivity, and the fortress begins to fall. Do not mistake the concessions of capital for generosity. When wages rise slightly, when benefits are offered, when reforms are proposed, they are calculated measures to stabilize, to appease, to delay the inevitable uprising. These crumbs are not justice, they are tactics. Justice comes only when you claim it. Revolution is not an act of anger alone, it is the deliberate assertion of collective will against exploitation. It is the refusal to endure injustice silently, the decision to replace the logic of profit with the logic of human need. The system will not bend unless it is pressed. It will not listen unless it is challenged. It will not change unless you refuse to endure. To endure is to participate in your own subjugation. To endure is to allow history to be written by the exploiters. Rise, comrades, and recognize that endurance is the enemy of freedom. Solidarity is your weapon, organization is your strategy, and collective action is your power. Only when the working class and the oppressed unite and refuse to accept the dictates of the few will the foundations of this system quake. Today you can choose to endure, tomorrow you may choose to resist. The fate of millions rests not in the hands of the powerful, but in the awakening of those who labor, who suffer, who dream. History waits for no one, but it rewards those who seize it. The chains that bind you are not forged by fate, but by those who profit from your silence. Cast them off. Organize, revolt. Claim the world that is rightfully yours. The system only changes when the people stop enduring. Capitalism does not endure because it is just, nor because it reflects the collective will of society, but because exploitation has been normalized to the point where it feels inevitable. Its survival depends not on genuine consent, but on the quiet tolerance of those who suffer under it. Workers are not asked whether they agree to surrender the value of their labor. They are compelled to do so by necessity. When survival itself is conditioned on obedience, consent becomes a fiction. The system presents exploitation as the natural order of things, disguising coercion as choice and submission as responsibility, ensuring that resistance appears irrational while endurance is praised as virtue from the moment labor is transformed into a commodity. Human life is reduced to a means rather than an end. Under capitalism, the worker sells not merely time or effort, but vitality itself, while the product of that labor is alienated and accumulated elsewhere. Justice is invoked rhetorically but denied materially, as wealth concentrates in the hands of those who own capital rather than those who produce it. The system demands that the worker accept exhaustion, insecurity, and deprivation as personal challenges rather than social crimes. By framing exploitation as an individual burden rather than a collective condition, capitalism shields itself from accountability. The endurance of exploitation is carefully cultivated. Education systems teach obedience before critical thought. Media glorifies wealth while obscuring the labor that creates it. Religion and ideology preach patience, sacrifice, and reward in some distant future, redirecting anger away from material conditions. Workers are encouraged to compete with one another for survival, transforming solidarity into suspicion. When individuals are isolated, their suffering feels singular and shameful, making resistance appear futile. Endurance becomes a private struggle rather than a public injustice, allowing exploitation to continue uninterrupted. Capitalism relies on crises, not as failures but as mechanisms of discipline. Unemployment, debt, inflation, and scarcity are not unfortunate side effects. They are tools that reinforce compliance. Fear of losing one's livelihood ensures submission more effectively than force. When workers endure worsening conditions without collective resistance, capital interprets silence as permission. Every hour of unpaid labor, every wage cut accepted, every injustice endured without protest strengthens the system's legitimacy. Exploitation persists not because it is unseen, but because it is endured. Justice under capitalism is conditional and selective. Laws protect property before people, profits before lives. The same system that demands discipline from the poor rewards excess among the wealthy. This contradiction is not accidental, it is essential. Capital requires inequality to function, because profit arises from the gap between what labor produces and what labor receives. To eliminate exploitation would be to dismantle the system itself. Thus, capitalism cannot offer justice without negating its own foundation, and so it substitutes justice with endurance. Consent is manufactured through ideology rather than freely given. Workers are told they are free because they may choose between employers, though all employers demand the same surrender of surplus value. Political participation is offered as proof of democracy, while economic power remains untouched. Voting every few years does not alter the daily reality of exploitation, yet it creates the illusion of control. This false consent pacifies resistance by convincing the oppressed that change is occurring when the underlying relations of production remain intact. The greatest threat to capitalism is not poverty, but consciousness. When workers recognize that endurance is not virtue but submission, the moral legitimacy of the system collapses. Exploitation requires not only labor but belief that suffering is deserved, temporary or unavoidable. Once that belief erodes, endurance gives way to refusal. History shows that systems built on exploitation persist only as long as people accept their conditions as fixed. The moment endurance is replaced by collective awareness, the foundations of capital begin to crack. Capitalism survives by turning human resilience into a renewable resource for profit. It drains patience, adapts to outrage, and absorbs reform as a means of preservation. Each generation is taught to endure slightly worse conditions than the last, while being told they are more fortunate than those before them. This gradual degradation masks decline as progress, ensuring that resistance is postponed indefinitely. Yet endurance has limits, and when those limits are reached, the system reveals its true nature, not as an engine of prosperity, but as a structure sustained by the continuous exhaustion of the many for the comfort of the few. A structure that can persist only so long as exploitation is tolerated, normalized, and borne in silence by those whose labor sustains everything while owning nothing and being told that this endurance is freedom. Poverty and inequality do not arise from individual shortcomings, moral weakness, or lack of effort, but are deliberately produced and maintained by the structure of class society. To portray deprivation as a personal failure is one of the most effective ideological weapons of the ruling class, because it transforms systemic violence into private shame. When poverty is individualized, its political origins disappear, and the system that creates it remains unquestioned. Capitalism depends on this distortion, because acknowledging poverty as structural will expose inequality as an instrument of domination, rather than an unfortunate byproduct from the beginning of class society. Material deprivation has been used to discipline labor. Those who own the means of production control not only wealth, but access to survival itself. Wages are not determined by the value workers create, but by what is required to keep them alive and productive. The constant presence of poverty serves as a warning, a visible threat that enforces obedience. It tells workers what awaits them should they resist, organize, or refuse exploitation. Inequality is not an error in the system, it is the system. Stabilizing force, the myth of meritocracy, is essential to sustaining this structure. By insisting that success is the result of talent and failure the result of laziness, capitalism absolves itself of responsibility for suffering. Structural barriers are erased, while personal narratives are exaggerated. Education, healthcare, housing, and opportunity are distributed according to class position, yet outcomes are presented as neutral reflections of effort. This ideological inversion allows privilege to appear earned and poverty to appear deserved, disguising domination as fairness. Poverty functions as a mechanism of control because it limits choice. When survival is precarious, resistance becomes costly. A worker burdened by debt, hunger, or insecurity cannot easily risk defiance. The constant struggle to meet basic needs drains energy that might otherwise be used to question, organize, or revolt. Inequality ensures that while some accumulate excess wealth, others remain trapped in cycles of dependency. This dependency is not accidental. It is engineered to keep labor cheap, and compliant inequality also fragments the working class. By creating layers of relative privilege and deprivation, the system encourages competition rather than solidarity. Workers are urged to compare themselves to those below rather than to those above, redirecting resentment horizontally instead of upward. Poverty becomes a stigma rather than a shared condition, isolating the poor from one another and from those who fear becoming poor themselves. This division weakens collective power and reinforces class domination without the need for overt repression. The state plays a crucial role in preserving these conditions. Laws, policies, and institutions are structured to protect property relations while managing poverty rather than eliminating it. Welfare systems are designed not to liberate but to regulate, surveil, and discipline the poor. Access to assistance is often conditional, humiliating, and insufficient, reinforcing the narrative that poverty is a moral failure requiring correction. Meanwhile, vast resources are mobilized to protect wealth, subsidize corporations, and rescue financial institutions. Revealing whose interests the system truly serves inequality is further entrenched through ideology that normalizes suffering. Hardship is romanticized as character building, while wealth is celebrated as proof of virtue. The poor are instructed to be patient, grateful, and resilient, while the rich are praised for ambition and risk-taking. This moral framework turns exploitation into destiny and endurance into obligation. As long as people believe their suffering is temporary or deserved, they are less likely to challenge its causes. Historical evidence consistently demonstrates that poverty persists regardless of productivity or abundance. Societies capable of producing immense wealth still maintain vast inequality, not because scarcity exists, but because distribution is controlled. Technological progress under capitalism does not abolish deprivation. It reorganizes it. New forms of work create new forms of insecurity, while profits concentrate further upward. The persistence of poverty in the midst of abundance exposes its political function as a tool of domination rather than a natural condition. To recognize poverty and inequality as structural is to reclaim dignity from blame. It shifts analysis from individual behavior to social relations, from morality to material conditions. This recognition undermines the legitimacy of a system that relies on deprivation to function. When the oppressed understand that their hardship is not a personal defect but a shared consequence of exploitation, the narrative that sustains class power begins to fracture. And the structures that depend on silence and self-blame face the possibility of being confronted, challenged, and dismantled by those who see their suffering not as failure, but as evidence of a system that requires inequality to survive, and therefore cannot be reformed without abolishing the conditions that produce poverty as a permanent feature of class domination rather than an exception within it. The ruling class does not maintain power primarily through force, but through fragmentation, isolation, and the systematic suppression of class consciousness. Its greatest fear is not unrest, but unity, not anger, but understanding. A worker who suffers alone may despair, but a worker who recognizes their suffering as shared becomes dangerous. Capitalism therefore labors constantly to prevent workers from seeing themselves as a class with common interests, replacing collective identity with individual struggle and competition. Isolation begins at the level of daily life. Workers are separated by schedules, contracts, industries, and geography, ensuring that each experiences exploitation as a private condition rather than a social relation. Temporary work, gig labor, and precarious employment dissolve stable communities and prevent lasting bonds. When workers are constantly replaced, relocated, or individualized, solidarity becomes difficult to sustain. This atomization is not accidental. It is a structural necessity for capital, because collective organization threatens the extraction of surplus value. Ideology reinforces this isolation by framing society as a collection of individuals rather than classes. Success and failure are narrated as personal stories disconnected from material conditions. The worker is encouraged to see co-workers as rivals and the unemployed as failures, while the capitalist appears as an innovator or benefactor. This narrative erases the shared position of workers within the relations of production, obscuring the fact that they all sell labor under conditions they do not control. By dissolving class into personality, the ruling class dissolves resistance. Class consciousness is further suppressed through education that prioritizes obedience over critique. From an early age, individuals are trained to follow rules, respect authority, and accept hierarchy as natural. History is taught without material analysis, focusing on leaders and nations rather than labor and struggle. Economic relations are presented as technical or inevitable rather than political and contested. By the time workers enter the labor market, they have been conditioned to accept exploitation as normal and to interpret injustice as misfortune rather than design. Media plays a central role in this process. It floods daily life with distractions, scandals, and spectacles that divert attention from structural realities. When inequality is discussed, it is framed as unfortunate but unavoidable, or as the result of corruption rather than class relations. Workers are encouraged to identify with celebrities, corporations, or national myths rather than with one another. Anger is redirected toward cultural or ethnic targets, fragmenting potential solidarity along artificial lines that serve ruling class interests. The suppression of class consciousness also depends on fear. Job insecurity, debt, and the threat of poverty discipline workers more effectively than open repression. When survival is precarious, organizing feels risky and resistance feels irresponsible. The ruling class exploits this fear by presenting itself as the guardian of stability, warning that any challenge to the system will result in chaos. Workers are thus coerced into silence, not because they approve of their conditions, but because they fear losing what little they have. Political systems under capitalism further neutralize class awareness by offering representation without power. Workers are invited to vote, debate, and participate symbolically, while economic decision-making remains firmly in private hands. This creates the illusion of democracy while preserving class domination. When political outcomes fail to improve material conditions, disillusionment sets in, which is then used to argue that collective action is futile. Cynicism replaces consciousness, benefiting those who already hold power. Even resistance is often co-opted. When worker movements arise, they are fragmented through legal restrictions, institutionalization, or selective concessions. Leaders are absorbed into bureaucracies, demands are narrowed, and radical critique is softened into reformist language. By channeling dissent into controlled outlets, the ruling class preserves the appearance of responsiveness while neutralizing transformative potential. The goal is not to eliminate resistance entirely, but to prevent it from developing into sustained class awareness. The most dangerous moment for any ruling class is when workers begin to recognize patterns in their suffering. When exhaustion, insecurity, and alienation are no longer interpreted as personal failures but as shared consequences of exploitation, isolation begins to break down. Conversation turns into organization, grievance into analysis, and frustration into collective purpose. This awakening threatens the ideological foundation of class power, because domination relies not only on economic control but on the belief that no alternative exists to maintain power. The ruling class must constantly interrupt this process. It must keep workers divided, distracted, and doubtful of one another. It must ensure that each person feels alone in a system built by millions. The moment workers recognize themselves as a class rather than as isolated individuals, the legitimacy of exploitation collapses, because power-rooted in division cannot withstand unity. And a system sustained by suppressed consciousness cannot survive. Once that consciousness emerges and spreads through shared experience, collective struggle, and the realization that what appears as personal hardship is, in fact, a common condition imposed to preserve a social order that depends entirely on workers never fully seeing themselves as the force that produces all wealth, therefore holds the potential to reclaim it. Collectively, collective organization is the only force capable of dismantling capitalist control, because capitalism itself is a collective system of domination that cannot be confronted by isolated individuals. Capital is not a single oppressor, but a social relation reproduced daily through institutions, laws, workplaces, and ideology. To oppose such a system with individual effort is to misunderstand its nature. The worker acting alone confronts the full weight of capital, while capital confronts workers as a unified power. Only when workers organize collectively do they begin to meet that power on equal terms. Capitalist control depends on the fragmentation of labor. Each worker is positioned as replaceable, expendable, and isolated, ensuring that resistance appears futile. Organization reverses this condition by transforming scattered individuals into a social force. When workers unite, they interrupt the smooth functioning of production, revealing where real power lies. Factories, offices, supply chains, and services operate only through collective labor. And when that labor is withdrawn or redirected through organization, the authority of capital is exposed at. Fragile and dependent collective organization is not merely a tactic but a transformation of consciousness. Through organizing, workers move from experiencing exploitation privately to understanding it socially. Shared struggle produces shared analysis, replacing resignation with clarity. The realization that one's suffering is not unique but structural dissolves shame and builds solidarity. This process cannot occur in isolation, because consciousness itself is shaped by social relations. Organization creates the conditions under which workers can see themselves not as competitors but as comrades. Capitalism actively resists this process because organized workers threaten profit, authority, and legitimacy. Employers invest heavily in union suppression, legal barriers, and ideological campaigns precisely because organization undermines control. When workers bargain collectively, the logic of unilateral domination collapses. When they strike, production halts. When they coordinate across industries, regions, or nations, capital loses its ability to discipline labor through fear and scarcity. No individual action carries this weight. Only collective force can impose limits on capital's power. Reforms achieved without organization are temporary and reversible. History demonstrates that concessions granted under pressure are withdrawn once that pressure disappears. Wages stagnate, protections erode, and rights are dismantled whenever collective power weakens. Capital tolerates reform only when compelled, never out of benevolence. Organization is therefore not a single event, but a sustained structure of resistance, capable of defending gains and expanding them. Without it, progress dissolves into nostalgia and exploitation reasserts itself. Collective organization also counters the ideological dominance of capitalism. Alone, workers are bombarded by narratives that justify inequality and normalize exploitation. Together, they generate counter-knowledge rooted in lived experience. Meetings, discussions, and shared actions create spaces where dominant myths are challenged and replaced with material analysis. Organization turns workplaces and communities into sites of political education, where theory emerges from struggle and struggle sharpens theory. Capitalist control extends beyond the workplace into housing, healthcare, education, and culture. Collective organization allows workers to confront these interconnected forms of domination as a unified class rather than as fragmented identities. It links economic struggle to social transformation, revealing that exploitation is not confined to wages but embedded in every aspect of life under capitalism. Through organization, demands expand from survival to dignity, from reform to systemic change. The ruling class fears collective organization because it exposes the true source of wealth and power. Capital appears dominant only because labor is divided. Once united, workers recognize that they produce everything while owning nothing, and that this contradiction is neither natural nor necessary. Organization converts this recognition into action, replacing passive endurance with deliberate resistance. It transforms workers from objects of exploitation into subjects of history. Every major advance won by the oppressed has been the result of collective organization rather than individual appeal. Shorter working hours, safer conditions, political rights, and social protections emerged through sustained collective struggle, not moral persuasion. Capital responds only to force, and organization is the means by which workers generate force without reproducing domination. It allows power to be exercised democratically, from below, through solidarity rather than hierarchy. Without collective organization, capitalism remains unchallenged because its strength lies in coordination, while labor remains dispersed. Organization aligns workers with their objective position in society, enabling them to act as a class rather than as isolated survivors. It is the process through which resistance becomes durable, strategy replaces spontaneity, and struggle acquires direction. In a system built on collective exploitation, only collective power can dismantle control and open the possibility of a society organized around human need rather than profit, where labor is no longer subordinated to capital and social relations are determined by cooperation instead of domination. Social transformation begins not with goodwill from above but with refusal from below. When the oppressed cease to accept suffering as fate and recognize endurance as a mechanism of control, every system of domination depends on the patience of those it exploits. As long as injustice is endured quietly, it becomes normalized, woven into daily life, and mistaken for necessity. Refusal is therefore the first rupture, the moment when the oppressed withdraw the consent that was never freely given and expose the system's reliance on submission. Endurance is often celebrated as strength, but under conditions of exploitation it functions as discipline. The oppressed are taught to survive rather than to challenge, to adapt rather than to confront. Hardship is framed as character building, resilience as virtue, and patience as wisdom, while the structures that generate suffering remain untouched. This moral inversion protects power by redirecting attention away from collective conditions and toward individual coping. Social transformation requires rejecting this narrative and naming endurance not as strength, but as imposed compliance. Refusal alone, however, is not enough. Isolated acts of defiance can be punished, absorbed, or erased. Solidarity transforms refusal into force. When individuals act together, their defiance ceases to be an exception and becomes a pattern. Solidarity reveals that oppression is shared and that resistance need not be solitary. It replaces fear with mutual support and converts vulnerability into collective strength. Through solidarity, the oppressed move from reacting to conditions toward shaping them. Solidarity disrupts the logic of domination by challenging the divisions that sustain it. Capitalist and hierarchical systems rely on fragmentation, encouraging competition, mistrust, and hierarchy among those who share the same material condition. The oppressed are separated by race, gender, nationality, occupation, and status, each division weakening their ability to act together. Solidarity does not deny difference but recognizes common exploitation beneath it. By acting together across imposed boundaries, the oppressed undermine the strategy that keeps them powerless. When the oppressed refuse to endure collectively, they interrupt the normal functioning of power. Production slows, institutions strain, legitimacy erodes. What once appeared stable reveals itself as fragile and dependent. Authority is exposed not as natural, but as contingent on cooperation that can be withdrawn. This moment is transformative because it shifts initiative from rulers to the ruled. The oppressed cease to be objects managed by the system and become agents capable of reshaping it. Solidarity also generates new forms of consciousness. Through shared struggle, individuals learn to see their experiences not as isolated hardships, but as expressions of broader social relations. Conversation becomes analysis, grievance becomes understanding, and understanding becomes strategy. This collective awareness is essential to transformation because it clarifies both the source of oppression and the means of overcoming it. Without solidarity, anger dissipates with it. Anger becomes direction. Social transformation is not an event, but a process sustained by collective action. Refusal must be organized, defended, and expanded. Solidarity provides continuity, ensuring that resistance does not collapse under pressure or fatigue. It creates structures of mutual aid, collective decision-making, and shared responsibility that prefigure a different way of living. In this sense, solidarity is not only a means to transformation, but its early expression, embodying cooperation in opposition to domination. The ruling order understands this danger and works relentlessly to prevent solidarity from taking root. It promotes narratives of individual success and failure, criminalizes collective action, and rewards compliance while punishing dissent. It attempts to exhaust the oppressed, convincing them that resistance is futile and unity impossible. Each act of collective refusal directly challenges this strategy by demonstrating that power is not absolute and that cooperation among the oppressed is both possible and effective. History advances when endurance breaks and solidarity emerges. Every gain wrested from domination has followed this pattern, when people who were expected to suffer silently instead acted together and refused to accept the limits imposed upon them. Social transformation begins precisely at this point of rupture, when the oppressed recognize that their shared condition gives them shared power, and that by standing together they can confront systems that rely entirely on their isolation and patience. systems that appear permanent only because resistance has been delayed, and that begin to unravel the moment endurance is replaced by collective refusal and solidarity becomes not an aspiration, but a lived practice capable of reshaping social relations at their foundation. Comrades, the truth now stands uncovered. Nothing you endure is accidental, nothing you suffer is deserved, and nothing that oppresses you is invincible. Capitalism persists not because it is strong, but because it has trained you to believe that resistance is hopeless and isolation is natural. It has survived by turning your patience into profit, your fear into discipline, and your division into control. Yet the moment you recognize yourselves as a class, the moment endurance gives way to refusal and isolation collapses into solidarity, the balance of power shifts irrevocably. You are not powerless fragments scattered across society. You are the force that produces all wealth, sustains all institutions, and makes life itself possible. The system that dominates you depends entirely on your labor, your compliance, and your silence. Withdraw those, and its authority disintegrates. History does not move forward through appeals to morality from the oppressed, but through organized struggle that makes exploitation impossible to sustain. Every gain ever won was taken, not granted. The task before you is neither abstract nor distant. It begins where you work, where you live, where you struggle. Speak to one another, organize collectively, reject the lies that blame you for conditions imposed upon you, replace competition with solidarity, endurance with resistance, fear with shared purpose. Understand that liberation is not an individual escape from injustice, but the collective destruction of the conditions that make injustice permanent. The future does not belong to those who adapt endlessly to suffering, but to those who decide that suffering is no longer acceptable. When the oppressed refuse to endure, when workers stand together as a conscious force, when solidarity replaces submission, the system that feeds on inequality loses its foundation. The world you are told is impossible has already been proven necessary. The only question that remains is whether you will continue to endure history as it is written for you, or rise together and become the authors of a new one.